Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar that we have chosen to call Seen and Heard, the Humanitarian Ripple Effects of the Middle East Conflict. This is a webinar that is organized by ACAPS and by Ground Truth Solutions. My name is Lars Nissen and I'm the CEO of ACAPS.
And my name is Sattler and I'm the CEO of Ground Truth Solutions.
When the conflict began in Iran in late February, immediately we started analyzing and looking at the immediate impact of the conflict, obviously, but also the global ripple effects. It quite quickly became clear that this was a conflict that would have effects way beyond the Middle East. And as we worked through the analysis of ACAPS, we started reflecting on how can we at the same time talk about the big picture, the ripple effects, the way the global economy is being affected, and the way people are being in humanitarian crises in different countries are being affected. How can we do that so that we capture both the big picture, the big trends, but also really understand what that more concretely means at the crisis level in the countries where the impact is felt directly. And that's when Meg and I started talking about doing this together. ACAPS works with analysis of crises, and we publish around 150 reports a year on literally any topic related to humanitarian action. We do that to inform humanitarian decision makers and to give evidence a bigger voice in decision making. But we don't have the intimate link to people affected by crisis that Ground Truth Solutions have. And that's why, Meg, I felt it was such a great compliment to have our two organizations work together.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us. It's great to be here with such a brainy array of speakers who we will introduce in a moment. Ground Truth, I guess, as Lars Peter says, we focus almost solely on what people affected by crisis are saying about a particular crisis to make sure that that is both a metric for humanitarian or solidarity work, success or otherwise, but also just to make sure that in all the sort of humanitarian jargon around needs and response, what people actually think is brought to the forefront. And so that was sort of our motivation for joining today. But on top of that, I guess I have to say that it kind of amazes me that, in 2026, we still have people in countries, including my own country, referring to this as, the Middle East crisis or the humanitarian situation in the Middle East solely, as though it's completely limited to that region and has sort of nebulous insular causes, and is not in fact something that to some extent a lot of us are affected by, but also in many ways involved in perpetuating. And so I think as we all sort of consider today the quite far-reaching impacts, some of which we will hear about today, we should all be keeping accountability at the forefront, because I think that's something that's been sort of missing from a lot of the humanitarian discourse.
Thank you, Meg. And the way we will do it is we will first speak to Dr. Huda Kassam, who is one of the analysts from ACAPS who wrote the report. She will take us through the main thinking behind shaping the analysis the way we did, and take us through some of the main ripple effects we see. Once Huda has given us the main layout or the main findings in the report, then Meg will take over and introduce three of Ground Truth's partners who will give each an overview of how the current situation is felt in their countries. And then at the end, we hope to have time for Q&A. So please write your questions into the chat on LinkedIn. We don't have an opportunity for you to speak directly into the meeting, but we will monitor the chat on LinkedIn. And so please put your questions in there and we will field them to our panelists. So it's a great pleasure to hand it over to you, Huda. Please tell us, what was the main motivation for shaping the report the way we did, and what were your main findings?
Thank you, Lars. It's nice to be here and to talk about this report. I think, as you mentioned, the idea of this interconnected and interdependent world economy, where a conflict in one place can quickly impact other places beyond the area directly affected by the hostilities through sometimes deliberate or sometimes accidental disruptions to energy and trade corridors. We saw that happen with the war on Ukraine. We saw it with the escalations in the Red Sea, and we are seeing it again now with the war on Iran. I think the main idea was to highlight the secondary impact without diminishing the direct impact of the conflict, which we highlighted in other reports focusing on Iran and Lebanon and the potential impact of escalations in Yemen as well in separate reports. We wanted to highlight those impacts and highlight how ununiform they are, because I know that the entire world was affected by higher energy prices and inflation, but that looks different when there are underlying vulnerabilities and compounded crises like conflicts, Gaza, Sudan comes to mind. And we also wanted to highlight the less visible impacts and the ones that were less talked about, at least at the time of writing the report, including the disruption to the supply routes, humanitarian supply routes, and the disruption to mediation efforts that were done by GCC countries. We divided the findings into four main themes. The first one was around energy and water security. The second was economy and food security, insecurity, conflict and social cohesion. And the final theme was humanitarian access gaps. For the first theme, it's obviously devastated the flow of energy around the world. We know that the Gulf region produces 1/3 of the world's crude oil, 17% of the natural gas. The disruption and the attacks on energy facilities, elevated energy prices. We saw countries, for example, like Pakistan and Bangladesh, were forced to take rationing measures to reduce fuel consumptions, meaning that they reduced working hours, transitioned to hyper mode education for schools. And though they seem like sort of benign measures to reduce fuel consumptions, they reduce, for example, children's in Bangladesh access to school meals, which are an important tool to combating malnutrition in the country. We saw also disruption to the production of electricities in countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, where people were forced to rely on generators that cost more and take out of their income, diverting it away from spending on other essentials like health and education. Water security was something that we highlighted in the report because a lot of the desalination plants in the Gulf region are situated around the Persian Gulf. Fortunately, this was not a risk that materialized through the reporting time, but we did see some attacks on desalination plants in Kuwait before the ceasefire took place. For economy and food insecurity, energy prices quickly translated into inflation in food prices. For example, irrigation costs doubled in Myanmar. Transportation costs increased, packaging costs increased, and that all trickled down to the consumer, threatening food security and eroding purchase power. For example, in Sudan, the purchase power for the Sudanese citizen decreased by 40%. This threatened the food security in the country. We also have countries that are dependent on the revenue of oil exports for their budgets. For example, if you take Iraq, there is a 90% dependency on oil revenue. And the disruption to oil exports resulted in a liquidity crisis in the country and threatened the government's ability to pay civil servants. Fertilizers was another important aspect of the economic impact. The disruption of urea fertilizers that go through the Strait of Hormuz particularly affected Kenya and Malawi, which are countries that depend on these types of fertilizers, forcing farmers to plant less land with less fertilizers means less output and less income for these agricultural family and affecting the overall agricultural sector in these countries. For social cohesion, there was unprecedented levels of displacement in Lebanon, and that led to a lot of tensions within the Lebanese society. And I think Nadine can speak to that better than I am. For example, we also saw talking about arming Kurdish groups in northern Iran and how that created the perception that these ethnic minorities colluding with external actors against the government, and the kind of protection risks that created for these communities, and the fact that the social sort of composition in Iraq looks a bit similar to Iran, and how those tensions were mirrored there. We saw protests in Bahrain and the tensions between the government and the Shia population, and also a host of protection risks in that country as well. Finally, the humanitarian access and mediation efforts. Dubai is an important logistical hub for humanitarian aid in the region. A lot of UN agencies and humanitarian organizations have their warehouses in Dubai. The disruption of shipping to the Strait of Hormuz disrupted the flow of aid to 25 countries in Africa and Asia. Humanitarian organizations were forced to use land and air routes, which increased the price of delivering aid and caused a lot of delays at a time when humanitarian organizations are grappling with funding shortfalls and trying to reduce operational costs. A very important and often overlooked aspect of the escalations was the disruption of mediation efforts. We know that Qatar and Saudi Arabia are major mediators in international conflicts and national and international conflicts, from Colombia to Sudan to Congo, Pakistan and Afghanistan as well. And all those efforts were disrupted, contributing to prolonging conflicts and the accompanying humanitarian impact of these conflicts as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Huda. Meg, can we hand it over to you for some reflections on how the broad picture Huda has just presented now sort of materializes in the various countries we got on the call?
Yes, thank you so much, Huda, for that very succinct but heavy analysis. It was kind of a lot to take in. But I'm happy now to be hearing from the vantage points of people whose nations and communities are quite heavily impacted by this. And it's not lost on me just to say from the outset that joining this call during all of this may also be taking a toll. So I just want to recognise that. I'm really pleased to introduce an all-star panel, all of whom we have worked with in some way or another in recent months and years. I'll start with Nadine Saba. Nadine is a lawyer and is the co-founder and director of the ACAPS Network for Development in Lebanon. She's got nearly 20 years of experience with NGOs in Lebanon. She's also a steering committee member of the Lebanon Humanitarian and Development Forum, as well as serving on the NEAR Network Council and on the NEAR as the NEAR Sherpa for the Grand Bargain, among many other accolades. She's been involved in development and relief activities for Syrian refugees, women, youth and child protection, as well as working with municipalities in Lebanon. We also have Dr. Nader Sayed, who is the team leader at AWRAD, Arab World for Research and Development. Nader has over 30 years of experience in humanitarian and development work across Palestine and the MENA region. He has a PhD in sociology, and his work centres on generating evidence that improves humanitarian response, strengthens accountability, and supports effective and inclusive programming. And last but not least, we have Borhan Wasameh, who is a program specialist at Action for Social and Economic Progress Somalia. He works with communities on peace building and climate resilient livelihoods. And I should say he's also very humble and insisted on a very short bio. I'm going to start with Lebanon and hand over to you, Nadine. I would say that, Lebanon has sort of been on everyone's minds this week and month. You've got people enduring very violent attacks. We're probably now all familiar with the line, the ceasefire didn't include Lebanon. And today we're hearing of peace talks. We've also just heard this very sort of dense and complicated analysis from Huda that has been done by ACAPS. I mean, taking, I guess, a step down, what does all it mean? What does this mean to live all of this? And how does this analysis and the current political climate resonate or differ from what you're hearing from communities on the ground every day?
Thank you, Meg, and thanks, Huda, for outlining, these broad points. The report does reflect a lot of the actuality, but it is not a complete one. Because if you want to look into Lebanon's actual crisis, you cannot forget what has been happening in the past 10 or 15 years before the actual 2026 conflict. I mean, this 2026 conflict is just, for me, a painful addition to a series of interconnected crises. And if I want to go back from the most recent to the oldest one, I would start with the 2024 conflict that had lasted around 2 months, again, between Israel and Hezbollah. I go back to the 2020 Beirut port explosion, the 2019 economic crisis and the currency devaluation. At that point, we've had the Lebanese pound losing around 90% of its value. And whenever we're talking about this, one needs to think of the impact in terms of inflation, price increases, unemployment, issues around the dollarization of the economy, the cash economy, and let's not forget the COVID pandemic and the impact of the Syrian crisis that has been everlasting since 2011. So for me, whenever we're speaking about the 2026 conflict, there are already layers and layers of instability and vulnerabilities that have covered the whole territory, and then you have this crisis. So whenever we're thinking about this crisis, as a friend described it, she said it's not a crisis layered on stability, it's a crisis layered on collapse. So on this moment, whenever you're speaking about the impact and the ripple effect, it takes a very much different dimension, because you're talking about different levels of vulnerabilities, and you're talking about effects that are sustained by a population that has been enduring so much, and at the same time by institutions that have not been able to provide the needed services even before the actual conflict. So de facto, you're starting by an extreme vulnerability, and you add to it the impact of the crisis. So if I want to go into how do I need to measure this and how do I examine it, I would go more in terms of, short term, medium term, and long term, because till now, we haven't recovered from the 2024 conflict. The losses, we still have people we still had people in 2025 and in early 2026, before the start of this conflict, who were not able to go back to their homes, who were still in collective shelters, and who were still relying on assistance from UN organizations, local and national and international organizations. So you already have a category that have been enduring this impact. Now, if I want to think of the actual conflicts, what we have been seeing, I will not go and talk a lot about IHL, about breaches of IHL, about accountability, and about, you know, the impunity. I think everybody has been witnessing. I've been told that the conflict has been heavily mediatized. People have been reading and learning and witnessing the actuality of Lebanon. So I will not go there, but I will just talk a bit about the impact, the human impact. We're talking about more than 2,000 deaths. Actually, the numbers of the Lebanese government is 2,089 since March 2nd. We're talking about a cumulative number of 6,762 injuries with more than 1 million displaced, around 1.2. So at first sight, the first thing you would say, what is needed is to ensure the survival of this displaced community. What's needed is the provision of shelter, food, wash, and if you look at the flash appeal, it has been funded with less than 1/3 of its required funds, and that is not a good indicator. Because what if it lasts even more? What do we do? I go back to the health needs, specifically after Wednesday's brutal attacks. We are at risk of depletion of supplies in some of the hospitals. You have a large number of primary healthcare centers that have been closed. You have a certain number of hospitals that have been evacuated and that are no longer operational. It's highly needed, and it will be highly costing as well when you look into the diversion of the routes and how shipments would need to arrive to Lebanon. So you're talking about a risk of not having them, and you're talking about a risk in terms of increase of prices. Now, schooling. We have been told that more than 250,000 children across the public school system are experiencing disruption to their education. We're in the middle of the scholastic year. And the disruption is because some of them have had to leave, and it's because as well that school closure has been not only affecting the South and Beqa that are mainly targeted, but it's also affecting other regions as schools have been transformed in collective shelters. So for me, these are kind of the very immediate needs that one needs to look at. And then here comes, you know, the big elephant in the room, social cohesion that Huda had been talking about. In the last weeks, we have been witnessing on the social media videos, rhetorics, narratives that are alarming, noting that yesterday was our 51-year commemoration of the, between quote unquote, civil war. So it is saddeningly timely to see how things are interlocking and what we are witnessing. So yes, social cohesion is in a much difficult situation than what was described in the report, because so many things have evolved. And when you've mentioned the peace talks, today we're witnessing a direct negotiation or first session between Lebanon and Israel at the US Department of State. And this is also one of the issues that is causing a lot of political debate and a lot of narratives that does not remain on a political level, but trickle down to be sensed as well in terms of social cohesion and in terms of interaction between displaced and host community. So for me, these are kind of the immediate. And if I want to go back into more alarming numbers, I want to go back to the 2024 conflict. It has been estimated that Lebanon incurred damages at around $14 billion. And definitely, we have not recovered from this. So if I look into what are the risks or impacts or what could be happening, you're looking into economic damage, noting that Lebanon relies a lot on tourism, and tourism sector has come to an almost complete halt. Some people are estimating it to be around 95%. You're talking, I mean, you have mentioned food security, but in terms of food security, The Ministry of Agriculture as well had estimated that 22% of Lebanon's total cultivated agricultural land has been damaged or is no longer accessible due to the ongoing conflict. So you have already two sectors that are severely impacted. And it's not surprising to say that economists are expecting a contraction of Lebanon's GDP. So these are also some of the things that one needs to think of on a medium term, if I may say. And I think Huda was clear when she was talking about the energy crisis in Lebanon, noting that energy crisis in Lebanon is not limited to energy, but goes as well beyond it to affect water, and by this affecting health, because most of our water pumps rely on energy or on generator or fuel run generators. So sustaining supplies in terms of fuel is a short, medium, and long-term requirement in the absence of an alternative. The last point that I would add in terms of the strains is also the strain on the Lebanon Central Bank and the foreign currency reserves. Lebanon has been trying to stabilize and has worked on stabilizing the exchange rate and trying to see a way to get money back to depositors and restructuring of bank. And with the money that's been currently put to sustain fuel, to intervene in the exchange market, there is fear that this additional strain would also impact a new economic crisis. So if I look into this, and then I look to what the field is telling us, because within LHDF, we have as well, an area-based coordination mechanism. And we have been hearing from our area-based coordinators that there is an increasing pressure on the collective shelters, there are gaps in assistance outside shelters, and there is a strain that is growing on the capacities of local responders. Adding to that we've had organizations whose centers have been destroyed, have been hit, whose families, their team member, their staff have been displaced, their families have been affected. So in a certain point, if you take a step back, and I forget that I'm in Lebanon, I take a step back and I look at this, I'm like, oh my goodness, what is still waiting for us? So when you say what can be done and is it reflecting the reality? Yes, it is reflecting the reality, but I think it is not reflecting the magnitude of the reality. What I think is it cannot really capture the feeling and the sense and the aspirations of the people. I heard somebody, I don't know, I was watching the news and I heard somebody saying, what is he feeling after his visit to Lebanon? And he said that he sensed a lot of anger within the communities, within the population, and anger directed towards different stakeholders, which is potentially the case. But what I believe is what most people in Lebanon are still thinking of and looking to is an aspiration. It's an aspiration to live safely, in dignity, within their houses, their villages, and their cities. And the question here is, what is our role in this? Shall we just deal with the consequences and try to support where needed, or are we required to do more? I honestly believe that humanitarians, again, between quote and quotes, we tend to shield ourselves behind what we call our principled action, which is very nice, very legitimate, and extremely convenient, but it's not enough. Additional work is needed to create and sustain solutions for conflicts, sustained economic activity that could create a true locally led resilience when facing a crisis. Conflicts do not come out of nowhere, and we are not coming out of nowhere. So I believe one of the things we ought to do is to be humble enough to talk to other actors, to review our own understanding of humanitarian and create an efficient dialogue with others. It is not enough for me just to deal with consequences, because we're creating, at least in Lebanon, in my perspective, a vicious, repetitive cycle. I hope I did not take too long. Thanks, Meg.
No, thank you. That was a very comprehensive picture that you've painted, but a picture of sort of collapse and complexity and acute need and longer term struggles, I suppose. And a lot of what you were saying reminded me a lot of conversations that I've had with Nader, actually. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from him in a moment. But I just want to quickly follow up on something, because I was doing some homework today, and I actually came across a speech that you gave in Geneva, and I'm not sure when it was, but as part of that speech, you said, should I tell you what we feel, or should I tell you what we fear, and would that make much difference? And when you were talking, it really made me think, is that how you're feeling now with the situation in Lebanon? I mean, to some extent, you've just answered that with this call for people to think longer term and think more creatively about finding solutions that actually sort of matter. Is there anything else that you want to say on that sort of, in that spirit, I guess, given the current situation that you're living through?
Actually, Meg, that was on the Grand Bargain annual meeting in 2024. It was a couple of weeks after the start of the conflict in 2024. And when I was at the HMPW earlier this month, we had a small donor briefing. And I said, I tried to go back to my notes to figure out what to tell you. And when I looked at the speech, I thought I could say it again, and it's still relevant. And this is exactly why I believe that something needs to change. We cannot just do business as usual. And the last years, when people used to talk about the Syrian crisis, I used to say the Syrian crisis should be a sign for us that you cannot do business as usual with such a protracted crisis. And now when I look into Lebanon, it hasn't been 2 years. I mean, I remember the 2024, I remember the 2006, I remember the 1990. You cannot just keep saying we are humanitarians, we just deal with the consequences, we try to help the people. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. But then what are we really doing? We're just putting a Band-Aid where the wound is bleeding, and is bleeding heavily. So in this respect, and accepting and respecting these humanitarian principles, but trying to make sure that these humanitarian principles are not a barrier to thinking differently, to looking towards different perspectives of coalition, collaboration, you want to name it, whatever you want to name it. But let's just think a bit outside, these kind of box of humanitarian principles, and try to say, what can we do jointly with others? Because obviously we cannot do everything ourselves, and we don't want to. So how can we create this collaboration to make sure that we can talk to the fears of the people, we can respond to their needs, and at the same time, we can exit when it's needed for us to exit, and not perpetuate a certain, certain business model that is living on repetitive crisis. Because we need to do that. Our business model has been, intervening in a crisis and a bit of competition between us. I think we need to go out of this, put this business model aside a bit, look into the reality. Most of the crises are protracted crises. It's no longer, come in, get out. It's a protracted crisis where we are required to do more. But at the same time, we are still saying we have our humanitarian principles and we cannot do more. So what do we do?
It definitely seems like something that a lot of us are very good at talking about, and we're less good at finding examples of where that's actually working. But I can't think of a better segue than that to hand over to Nader because this reminds me of so many discussions that we have had. Turning to you, Dr. Nader, I guess there's attention on Palestine, of course, at the moment from all corners. But again, where is that attention coming from? And are we really listening to the people who deserve to be heard? When the attacks on Iran started, I think immediately many started fearing, what does this mean for Palestine? And of course, Israeli attacks intensified kind of in the dark during that time. We have done a lot of work together and I guess have come together at various points on wanting to know what people think and what people demand, not just what their needs are, sort of believing that this humanitarian box can be sort of limiting and harmful, particularly in the Palestinian context. The report talks about humanitarian ripple effects. I guess in your perspective, is this the right framing? Do you think that it's possible to separate kind of humanitarian impacts out from the broader human impacts of what's happening? How would you and Aurad kind of respond to both this analysis and the current situation?
Thank you so much, Meg, and everyone. Nadine, thank you. You've saved me much of my presentation. You represent me in, you know the context, the dynamics. We've been there, we've done it. Khalas, as we would say in Arabic, and I know many people speak Arabic here. Enough is enough. As much as things change, they continue to be the same. So for us to pretend and continue to pretend and sit around here, pretending that humanitarian systems and humanitarian assistance is, acontextual, apolitical, no relation to the political economy. It's just, framing ourselves into being, part of it. And so we just have to be, it's time for reckoning. There is no other way around it. And it depends, within the system, whose side are you on? And the sides are very clear now. And it's not about Gaza, and it's not about Lebanon, and it's not about Sudan. It's about a historical, Meg was talking about the space, and this is not the Middle East, this is the global system. And so to pretend that this is Middle East crisis and they're just, it's just that, without understanding who pays for this, and the taxes that people in the north and some in the south, the Western sort of nations, colonial nations that continue to be colonial, this is paid for by the same taxpayers who pay the same money from the same pot that they give humanitarian assistance. So if, we just have to just be real about it and make sure that we understand that this is totally interconnected, spatially, but it's also historical. How do you look at Somalia or Sudan or what happens in Congo without the legacy that continues in terms of colonization? It just doesn't make sense. And more, this colonization model is becoming more and more hegemonic. And hegemony implies not only the use of militarism, but using civic and civil resources, including civil society, including research, including humanitarian assistance, to just balance and make sure that the system continues, and the 20% in the West are still the 20%. We get the 80% of what we have around the world, with a spearhead in the Middle East, which is, we know the other Western nation in the region, which is, the most colonial power in the region, assisted by the agents in some of the countries that, that we know of. Okay, so it's not bound by place, it's not bound by time. Lebanon, the use of crisis is just so, it's a joke. Crisis? What crisis are we talking about? And for most people here, just to talk, I was talking to, some of the researchers, people in the field in the morning, just to get myself ready for this. And, we're so cool about it. This is the truth. We're so calm about it. We've seen it. This is a continuation of the same de-development, destruction of societies, keeping them totally dependent, but not dependent in a dignified way. They have to be dependent in the most undignified way as much as possible. So the question is, how do you place humanitarian assistance? How do you place humanitarian systems in all of this? Before the attack on Iran, the war in Iran, it's not in Iran, it's on Iran, was preceded by quote unquote a ceasefire. A ceasefire of what? Of occupation? There is no ceasefire. As Meg was saying, objectively, there is no ceasefire. There is one side that's killing people around and squeezing them in a very, very small place. Now we have a yellow. We had the smallest place on earth. Now 60% of it are also taken away. So everyone is sent to this camp that humanitarian assistance will be unfolding. So in a way, a ceasefire or an Iran or a war in Iran or a war in Lebanon or whatever, these are distractions, very serious distractions of a continuation of the same examples of a hegemonic system, like a centaur that uses its head, but also it uses its might and its power to dominate nations, and the evidence is everywhere. So for us to think of the Iran war, it would be, for most people, they would smile, they would not laugh, but they would smile that this is affecting anything, really. What's going on is, that the crisis is for Israel to attack Gaza and for the United States to attack Iran. These are, yes, crises, but and the fuel and the oil and all of that. But what we have here is basically a combination of global factors, regional factors and local, of course. We have, also within the countries themselves, also questions in terms of how this is impacting how the system is working. But it's also business as usual. It's how the system works. It's how the humanitarian system works. It is the stage of development that it is in. In Gaza, after the ceasefire, everyone is pretending that this is it. So we have seen, then Iran came, the war in Iran came to provide an additional cover for reinforcing the political and colonial status of Israel, and therefore who it works for, which is, the West, basically, in the region, in Gaza, controlling Iran on the one hand and the Gulf on the other hand, equally, both of them are going to be losing. So it's all of these things. So what we're seeing in Gaza are evidence of this seamless approach, which is repetitive in all quote unquote crises in the third world countries for the most part, very much almost. But Ukraine is another issue, really, but it's as important, of course. So this combination of factors allows the actors to have more or less leverage. So you may have resistance. Maybe Israel has less leverage, so the international community might have a higher leverage. So if you look at how many times the UN now is mentioning Gaza, and how many times it's mentioning other places. So immediately it shifts. The interest shift. The funding envelope is declining. We have seen it. We're seeing it firsthand. For example, in terms of how many TPM visits do we make a day? Now we are at 50%, okay, instead of the 100% that we always, that we had prior to the ceasefire. Now we're at this is sort of a small sign. Then also, asking Palestinian staff to leave and not giving them salaries and all of that are becoming now, all the time. But also, which is more interesting, is cuts in terms of types of assistance, and that's what we have to be careful about. For example, we look at WFP now, and how they are working with bakeries, just to make bread, which is the most basic sort of human need, need in that community at least. So what we're seeing them now preparing and almost, getting to a point where they will only fund fuel, but not materials. Okay, what's going on here is an institutionalization of the humanitarian system that is aligned with the political developments replacing the humanitarian system with a system that's antagonistic to the Palestinians, basically, which will be fully controlled by Israel and the United States. So you see the types even of assistance, then and the type of institutionalization that is going on. Then we also see, more and more signs of again different institutional arrangements. For example, much of what WFP and UNICEF and others were provided almost halfway by Palestinian NGOs. Now, we have seen after the ceasefire, and now we almost have every Palestinian large NGO out of the picture, with a concentration on US aid, US funded types of arrangements, including global communities and so on, instead of PARC, which is the Palestinian Agricultural Committees, or Ma'an, or any of these organizations. So those are not providing anything anymore, and that is creating a new issue, which is who do we go to for assistance? If these are then these institutions have an interest, the local institutions and internet have an interest in keeping their own lists. So the lists now are basically monopolized by these institutions, which is depriving other, their beneficiaries from benefiting from these American, types of more and more American sort of approach to assistance. So there are new arrangements, there are new ways, but much more also is basically the forced cancellation of humanitarian assistance, where you had 46 international organizations kicked out of Gaza, basically totally prevented, totally criminalized by Israel, including, for example, Doctors Without Borders, which was one of the main organizations providing community-based health services. They're not there anymore. And many of the projects that we know were funded, including with international organizations, are stopping in preparation for the new phase. So one of the other things that as we speak, we're noticing is how is this covered and how this process unfolds as almost always, when the Gaza, the genocide started by Israel, we immediately received some of the best technical people in the world in humanitarian assistance. UNICEF, WFP, all of their organizations immediately did not even rely on their own local staff. They immediately went to Ukraine and they picked some of the best technical experts in their line of work. They brought them here. Now what we're hearing and what we almost know from our connections is that most of them will be leaving. The question, will they go to Lebanon? Where is the next urgent, huge crisis? Do they consider Lebanon, huge enough? We haven't seen that before. We haven't seen it. It's gonna continue to be a smaller envelope in Lebanon for all kinds of reasons. So the crisis, is again, I do not believe that the humanitarian system as is and working with it will lead to any change. It is actually, for the most part, and this is something that more research and more people can write about it. There are writings about it. Is either and reinforcing colonialism, the historical colonial system, and it is at the same time paying for it from the same pockets that create the bombs and the missiles and so on and so forth. Do we have a role? Well, it's a choice. We all have to make choices. We're working with GTS because we think they're progressive enough to work with. But is that enough? We know it's not. It's, accountability, as Nick was saying. Who's going to hold the aggressor accountable, who allows you to die or not to die? He decides if you die or don't die. So again, it is, if we want to be serious about this and we want to work with the system, reset doesn't work. Small changes do not work. It is time of reckoning. The world is changing and it will be changing. And transformative assistance as such does not exist. Every assistance we have seen so far in the third world has only been part of de-developing these countries and making them more dependent on the West, for political dictation and for mostly, their best interest, as well as, our neighbor here, so they're not our neighbor, we live around them here. So in terms of, our research, and now we're working with GTS on sort of a resilience index. How do we get from genocide, where people are in this place, feeling the way they feel, living the way they live, to life, basically. So we're looking at that, and as we're doing that, we're making a great deal of dialogue in the field with, community members, leaders, experts, this and that. And everyone's saying basically the same thing. We're not used to this type of assistance. We're not gonna lose our dignity, our pride, our aspirations for self-determination and just independence, just feeling on the individual level as a breadwinner, as a father, as a mother, that I'm able to fend for my children and protect them and the security that Nadine was talking about. If I'm unable to do that within this system, and if humanitarian assistance does not pave the way and is connected to recovery, reconstruction, and so on in a way that's emancipatory to nations, then again, we're just playing with words, and we're just being paid for being part of this system. So so that's, I think, in general, what I wanted to say. And thank you so much. I guess that's it.
Thank you so much, Nader. I'm not going to try and summarize that, but I will say that next time I see someone on LinkedIn who's asking the question of whether impartiality and localization can coexist, I'm just going to give them your phone number, if that's all right. I'm going to take sort of a swift geographical turn and send us to Somalia now. And Borhan, you and the ACAPS team obviously spend a long time talking to people on a daily basis. There has been a lot of talk sort of generally about how this situation will impact other people enduring other crises, and we heard some of that from Huda earlier. I guess the first question would be, what do you observe about the impact on things like markets in the region now, based on some of the preliminary chats that we've had? And what do you think would be the impacts if this expanded any further?
Thank you very much, Meg. I really resonate with what Dr. Nadine and Dr. Nader were saying. And I commend the ACAPS team, because it really captured the impacts that one seemingly separate conflict is having throughout. And we are certainly feeling the impacts in the whole region of the Horn of Africa, because as you know, there are historical, cultural, and commercial connections between our region and the Gulf region, or the Middle East in general. So any instability, any disruptions is felt more acutely, even before other regions feel. But within the region, there are some differences in the effect it is having. For example, we're seeing the transportation sector in Ethiopia is very much badly affected. There are queues and disruptions and disconnections. And in Kenya, for example, we're seeing the regions, the marginalized regions within Kenya that are not, for example, connected to the national grid are feeling it. Places like Mandera, electricity disruptions, power blackouts, because they depend on fuel, whereas in other parties they are connected in a grid that is more diversified in terms of energy sources. But within the region of Horn of Africa, the most affected is, of course, Somalia, and that is due to the structural vulnerabilities that exist, because Somalia has been in civil war for a while, and there has been state collapse, which it is recovering from. But there are fragility and vulnerabilities that are particular to it. So Somalia is very much import dependent, including for food matters, and there are very limited safety nets. For example, there are no energy or national reserves which can cushion this, at least in small parts. So it is directly affected. And on top of that, the region, Somalia in particular, has been very much affected by a long drought. We're in the middle of a very biting drought. And on top of the conflict and the political fragility, there is that drought. Already, even before this conflict started, about 6.5 million people in the country have been termed as being food insecure. And of those 6.5 million, 2 million have already been classified by the UN IBC system as being in level 4, which is at emergency levels. So in a situation like this, when there are gaps in food availability, you can imagine what is happening. And there has also been, on top of that shock of drought and food insecurity, a near total withdrawal of humanitarian aid due to firstly the Ukraine war and later on with Trump's restrictions, which was followed on by the EU of cutting aid. So there is those many levels that the people are being impacted. And for me, on the ground, aside from that general aspect of crisis upon crisis, it is really comes down to a cost of living crisis at the household level. The food prices are rising, fuel is rising. In urban settings, for example, the price of gas cylinders has close to doubled. So, which has repercussions in the sense where you see in households, urban settings, like Mogadishu, where they use cylinders, for example, now reverting back to charcoal, which has an environmental impact. And you can imagine that is in urban setting. In rural setting, it's even far worse. So it's a cost of living crisis, and the food prices are rising. The energy cost is, some of it is even having some repercussions in terms of conflict and social cohesion. In Mogadishu, for example, there has been, because of the fuel rises, many of the population depend on public service transportation. And those with less means, they depend on, for example, the more affordable three-wheelers. In the region, we call them tuk-tuks, which depend on diesel. So many of these tuk-tuk drivers, for example, they don't own the vehicle. They rent the vehicle itself. So they depend, when the energy costs rise, it becomes extremely not sustainable. They need to pay the rent for the tuk-tuk, for the vehicle, and they need to pay for the high fuel. So they have to raise the cost, which is felt by the man or woman in the street. So they went on a strike recently, and it was a big issue in Mogadishu, and there were demonstrations, and many of the drivers were imprisoned by the police and so on. And the government was accusing them of having political motivations or being at the helm of, or directed to go on a strike by the opposition. Because in Somalia, for example, you have to appreciate we are, the term of the current government is ending, so we are soon to go into elections. So there is heightened political atmosphere. So any time where such things happen, they take on an even deeper crisis. So on all those, it is really an issue of cost of living that could have political ramification, that could have social cohesion and conflict aspects as well at the local level, but also regionally. And many people in the region are really praying that the conflict doesn't spread down to the Red Sea, because the impact would be even more acute if the Houthis actively enter, and then there are disruptions on Bab el-Mandab and the flow of shipping and transportation on the Red Sea, because it would have even a bigger ripple effect, because a country like Somalia, for example, one of its big export sectors is livestock, which goes to mostly the Gulf, but primarily within the Gulf to Saudi Arabia. So that sector is now cushioned because the shipping is still flowing. If it is disrupted, then that impact would be felt at a rural setting across Somalia, because the livestock sector is one of the sectors that survived from collapse. And if that is disrupted, it will have even a bigger ripple effect. And already in the humanitarian sector, we are feeling it. Those who were dependent on the humanitarian sector, first of all, it was near total withdrawal already of humanitarian aid to the region in general, but particularly in Somalia. And but also on top of that, for example, in the 2026 humanitarian needs response plan for Somalia, it is only 12% funded. So you can imagine it is already extremely poorly funded, and agencies like Save the Children are saying like they have to do they Save the Children released a report recently saying the operational cost of delivering food has skyrocketed. For example, biscuits that they were for nutrition, for example, it's costing double or triple the price because of shipping disruptions. And what they had to begin with was small. So in a plan that is about 12% funded, if you add that on top of that, the operational costs of that are skyrocketing, you can imagine. But on top of that, I really resonate with what Nader was saying, in the sense that humanitarian aspect is an industry, and it is just a part of what is happening on the ground. There is a lot happening on the ground in terms of solidarity, in terms of collective action, in terms of helping one another, philanthropy, zakat, and so on. And that is still going, but very much hampered by what is happening in general. And it will continue. The solidarity among the people of helping one another and to live in dignified lives will continue. But the geopolitics that is not of our own making is affecting everyone, especially the most vulnerable regions like Somalia.
Thank you so much, Borhan. I think it's really important to get such a sort of nuanced on the ground view of what's happening, because I think Somalia is it's a place where on the one hand, as you've described, there's kind of so much need, for want of a better word, and as you described, a lot of anger. It's also, if I may be so bold as to say, a place where there's a lot of humanitarian self-congratulation, I would say, about, here is a pilot that we did and it went so well. And I think it's just so interesting to sort of hear some of the tensions between those two narratives. There's probably a whole book in what each of you have said, and I would ask you 1,000 more questions, but I know that we've got questions coming in from LinkedIn. So I might hand back over to Lars quickly to kick us off with moderating those.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you to all three of you for extremely powerful presentations of the situation in your countries. We have a couple of questions here from LinkedIn. One is, how is the Iran escalation affecting the durability of the Gaza ceasefire and the incentives of key actors to maintain it? And that goes to you, Dr. Nader.
Thank you. I'm not sure really. Again, I think the parties on the ground, which again now the minimal presence is for Hamas. I think Hamas had an incentive at least during the war, and still has an incentive in relation to Lebanon and Hezbollah to be part of that resistance movement. So there is that, but much more, seeing that the international community does not honor its commitments and its promises in terms of even the agreement that's an absolute. It's absolutely dehumanizing, and it's absolutely just providing the justification. We've reached the ceasefire, khalas, it's over, we're done. But we're not done. Israel is encroaching, is redistricting, if you want to call it. Geography is different. They're the only actors that's relevant. They have more leverage now, international organizations, than any time before. So Israel doesn't need, to be questioned about its intentions. Other parties are being always questioned. Oh, will Hamas join? Will Hamas not join? But again, in the humanitarian sector, and that's where we are focused on, not, again, in relation to the politics, of course, and the political economy. But I think it is how, that relationship between how the political developments are ongoing and how the actions and the policies and the procedures that are followed by the money for the most part. So again, it is the question for that in terms of solidarity and donors. It's very much within the same realm. My organization works with international partners, with donors, and all of that, and we try to be the voice as much as we know and as much as we can. But we know that's not how things will change around the world, because again, this is not about Gaza. Absolutely not. And if Gaza, especially Gaza, and of course Lebanon and everywhere else, but reaching that level of inhumanity with a response that's just so similar to anywhere else, as if it is not human-made, it's just mind-boggling, really. So I would focus on advocacy and working with solidarity groups, uncovering the relationship between the political economy and who controls the economy in Congo, and why are 6 million people are killed in one decade in that place. And I want to follow the money and follow the political economy by showing those who have good intentions. But again, it's not about intentions. It is about a system that's very much convenient, and with all the solidarity groups in the West, which is amazing. Again, I'm not saying it's not. All I'm saying is that it's part of the machine, that the same exact machine that kills people, and it's the same machine that provides them with food that is not dignified, that does not lead to independence, that does not lead to self-determination. It only reinforces dependence. And I think that's the other question as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we do have a second question from Laila Sami around, do you anticipate that the rising cost of living would result in tensions in some countries? And I'd like to ask you that, Dr. Nadine, together with a second question. You mentioned tensions around social cohesion in Lebanon. Would we expect that to move beyond social media posts? Should we be anticipating intercommunal clashes? Would be the second question. Please.
Okay. I'm hoping it won't go beyond social media. There have been some, small incidents here and there, but if there is any staple in the Lebanese landscape, is the volatility, and things can change very fast. So I think there are a number of variables and a number of factors that can tip, the balance from one side to the other. We had witnessed a couple of protests in front of the Sarai, which is the seat of the prime minister and the government. But then we have seen calls to stop this and put it in a calmer zone. So I cannot tell that yes, that would happen, or no, that would not happen. What I can tell is that I hope it won't, because that would be something we really cannot deal with at the moment. One. Second, what I would say is that we are living day by day. So how can I cannot even plan for a week or for a couple of weeks. We're really living day by day. And mind you, I'm away of the main places of attack. I am in the north of the country, where are the main points of attacks are, in the south, Beirut, Beqa. So it is extremely difficult to say, it would or would not happen. What I would say is that I hope it won't happen, but I would not be surprised if tempo remains as is, that it would happen. I wish it won't, and I hope things will calm down and all political parties can reach a point where they can keep the dialogue within the institutions and within the state institutions, rather than it to go on the streets. But tensions are high. Now, in terms of the rising prices, we have been talking and we have been seeing that, people are trying to adopt some, coping mechanisms. This has been the case for the last couple of years. But again, just as what our colleague Burhan was saying, if things change, if, the Houthis would want to participate, if we have additional pressure on Bab el-Mandab, if we have all those additional things, you don't know, because people are not well. People are afraid, people are angry, people are not well. So you don't know, and it really depends on how developments would go. Again, I would hope it won't. I would hope that we reach a solution where things would stabilize and we could really take a break. But I cannot really say neither yes nor no. Over.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question now to Burhan. Both the colleagues from Gaza and from Lebanon have very clearly and very critically described the way that the humanitarian system no longer is fit for purpose. From your perspective, from the Somali context, what does that look like? Do you experience some of the same tension between the way the humanitarian system operates and what is actually needed?
Yes, definitely. Obviously, on the ground, you can tell that the humanitarian assistance is valuable in the sense that it saves lives during emergencies. But aside from that, there is no impact in terms of lifting people's lives, in terms of development and so on. But definitely I wouldn't discredit it, because if there is a disaster, a flood or whatever, and even one person is saved, that is good. But on the long run, the humanitarian assistance has not had much positive impact in Somalia. And in fact, when some countries, particularly the American administration, for example, said they will be cutting aid, this many people, including those in need, were saying good riddance. Like that is perhaps will force us to kind of come up with local and grounded solutions to our problems. And definitely people throughout they have been relying on themselves. There are many instances of collective action being taken to remedy collective problems, and that will continue. But I think it's a wake-up call, and many people are expecting good things with this near total withdrawal of humanitarian aid. In the long run, it would be felt very badly, especially those in need, because hundreds of clinics have been shut without much replacement. But in the long run, I think something good will come in terms of relying on self also.
Great. Thank you very much. Now, maybe just a question for you, Huda. We have listened to three very powerful and in many ways very frustrating descriptions of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, Lebanon, and Somalia. Now, when we as ACAPS write a report like this, we inevitably zoom out and try to paint the big picture. Having listened to the colleagues, how do you feel about the job we did? How can we do better in terms of capturing the key aspects of a crisis like that? If you could speak a bit to that. And then I would say, secondly, give us a bit of a perspective moving forward. What is our thinking on the scenarios that we can see unfolding? Because what's been so clear throughout this discussion is the disconnect between the way this crisis or this situation is being described in the media. Every morning we wake up to some new news of the day, and then the long protracted underlying issues that we have heard about today. So what does it look like moving forward, and how can we capture some of the experiences that have been shared here better? Is that possible?
Yeah. I think one thing that stood out to me in all of the panelists talked about is probably the need to zoom out even further than we did in the report, and perhaps talk about the normalization of IHL violations and conflicts, and how that the level of impunity that Israel and the US enjoyed during the attacks on Gaza and Lebanon last year and the year before that contributed in a way or another to the conflict that and the war in Iran. The normalization of attacking civilian infrastructure, the normalization of forced evacuations for mass numbers of people, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon, and how sort of that impunity made it possible for that sort of trend to continue within that war with Iran, and what that means to populations affected by these conflicts, because that amplifies the impact of civilians who should be protected under IHL. I think they also raised a very important point about the current humanitarian system and whether or not it perpetuates the humanitarian needs within communities that they attempt to serve. And I think this is a valid question that we continue to think about in ACAPS. I can tell you that, for example, attempts to change the humanitarian structure in Gaza, the militarization of assistance, is something that we are considering writing a report about. And I think that it's fair to say that the changes in the way the humanitarian system is being structured are alarming. And we're seeing, for example, the US now providing health assistance to countries in Africa and demanding access to minerals in return for that. And obviously, this is something that we need to be keeping an eye on and addressing in future reports as well. In terms of what is going to the projections to the future, I think there's a lot of uncertainty, as you said, Lars. I think we can see that fortunately the diplomatic track is still ongoing, and there still seems to be negotiations to be had in Pakistan. But I think the idea of a resolution that addresses the underlying issues that resulted in the conflict in the first place are quite slim, at least in the near future. And whether we're going to see an extension of the ceasefire, with diplomatic negotiations going in the background, whether we're going to return to full hostilities, and whether we're going to see a ceasefire like the one in Gaza or the one in Lebanon, where one party adheres to the ceasefire and the other party keeps violating it, keeping everyone at the edge of their seats, not knowing when it will collapse. It's very uncertain, but even if we are to see a lasting ceasefire, we are already in a place where the impact is not going to be reversed. It will take months, if not years, for energy production to go back to its former pre-crisis levels. I think, for example, Qatar has lost 70% of its natural gas production for the next 3 to 5 years. That would continue to keep prices of oil elevated and energy elevated. The underlying issues that resulted in the conflict are unlikely to be resolved, as I said, so that would keep insurance premiums high. So if we're going to take the escalations in the Red Sea as an example, I can tell you that 1 year, 4 months into the ceasefire, insurance premiums are still elevated, and the flow of trade through Bab el-Mandeb is nowhere what it was before the escalations took place. We're looking at a 40 to 50% risk of recession, global recession, which means more inflation and more struggles for families across, poor families across affected countries to meet their basic needs. Reports indicate that 45 million people are going to be pushed into poverty. Food insecurity is still a very important issue that we need to look at. And I think Mercy Corps put out a report yesterday saying that even harvest within 2027 is going to be affected by fertilizers prices. And that is going to have a detrimental impact on food security across poor countries that are mostly dependent on imports. A very important aspect, I think, that one that is not talked about a lot is that a lot of the Gulf countries are now going to divert some of their funding towards defense budgets, and that is going to take away from their contribution to humanitarian and developmental assistance. We know that these countries were expected to finance a lot of the recovery and reconstruction efforts in Gaza and Lebanon. We don't know what would happen to that. These countries, 3 of the GCC countries, are on the list of the top 10 contributors to humanitarian aid in 2025. So this is big, and this will even worsen the humanitarian funding crisis that we're living through now. Also, there's a lot of developmental funding that they provide unilaterally, bilaterally to governments in the region. I think, one of the beneficiaries is definitely Egypt. I think there is a lot of question on whether Egypt is going to be able to maintain public services without that level of assistance. I think there was a question about the possibility of tensions and dissidents because of increased prices. I think, this is a great risk in so many countries, and we saw that already happening in Mogadishu and Mauritania. So, yeah, I think the situation is quite dire. A final point on social cohesion. I think this is one of the issues that are long-lasting and would even last beyond the 2-year mark that we're talking about food insecurity. these sort of tensions become self-reinforcing, creating situations where segments of the population get marginalized and have limited access to services and assistance.
Thank you so much. I think trying to summarize such a rich conversation at the best of times would be difficult, but it's the middle of the night here, so bear with me. But I think overall what's been clear from all of this are a few things. I think one is that the impacts are real, objectively, subjectively, and potentially for different reasons than maybe first thought. But there is acute and long-term human suffering that looks set to get a lot worse. We heard that naming long-standing, complicated injustices as kind of discrete, small crises is not helpful, and we should probably stop doing that. And at the community level, I guess we heard this combination of anger and solidarity, you know, strength, but also struggle. And it feels like across all the contexts, there's this need for justice, accountability, and I guess the questions that raises for what does that global solidarity look like? You know, is the aid model with its impartiality caveats going to cut it? We heard from Somalia that aid is so critical because people are really needing it, but still when aid was cut, people said good riddance. So, you know, what is the best alternative there? I guess across all three contexts, we heard about the growth and the recognition of local solidarity and leadership. We heard especially from Palestine and Lebanon, strong calls for justice and just for being more ambitious, you know, pushing for more structural changes, which feels necessary, I guess, hearing this conversation and the analysis from Huda. Because I guess despite all of the obvious reform arguments, there was also the final message from Huda about just the diversion of aid funding to militaries and the fact that if there's going to be a lot less funding, are we doing the best that we can with it? So much food for thought. Huge thanks to Huda, Nadine, Borhan and Dr. Nader. Thanks also to ACAPS for allowing its analysis to be ground truthed in such a way, which is a rare thing in our sector, and I think hopefully serves as a good example for others. And I hope we can continue in this spirit. So I'll hand back over to Lars for any closing remarks.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you to all of the panelists for your very powerful interventions. I think it is incredibly important that we don't just sit from a remote, comfortable position as ACAPS and write clever reports, but that we really, as you say, make ground truth the solution. It's important that we have an evidence-based global humanitarian narrative that can help mobilize the support that is obviously needed and that we have talked about today. And I think in what we struggle with is to find ways of really giving voice or elevating the voices of the communities and the people affected directly by crisis. And I just want to give a big thank you to Nadine and Borhan and Nader for your very challenging and very powerful statements today. It's been a real pleasure to have. It's been a privilege to listen to this and to have this sort of honest exchange about how we can do better in terms of helping in this desperate situation. So thank you. And we should say thank you to all the people online who have listened in for the past hour and a half as well. It won't be the last time we do this for Ground Truth Meg. We need to have another opportunity for this kind of exchange. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.